This submission is a passionate political monologue warning right-wing voters against supporting a coalition involving Yair Golan, Eisenkot, and Bennett, using Golan's controversial remarks about Jewish terror following the Havat Gilad murders as proof of a dangerous ideology. So, a key theme running through this material seems to be the author's strong, unflinching characterization of Yair Golan's rhetoric in the immediate aftermath of a tragedy.
Yeah, anchoring strong ideological labels directly to the specific evidence presented prevents the commentary from feeling like a generic partisan attack.
Right.
But the weakness in this opening section is really how the text handles the transition from the subject's words to the author's actual conclusion.
How so?
Well, the script presents the quote where Golan says, "Jewish terror will be eradicated," and then it just immediately leaps to branding him a fascist and an anti-Zionist.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that is a huge jump.
Exactly. For a listener who isn't, already deeply convinced of this viewpoint, this feels like an entirely unsupported logical leap. It relies on the emotional momentum of the tragedy to justify the name-calling rather than actually proving the thesis based on the quote provided.
I mean, the author clearly has immense passion here. The raw, visceral delivery is definitely a strength of the source material. It captures a genuine sense of outrage.
It really does.
But dropping incredibly heavy words like fascist into a text without building a foundation for them triggers what we often call a semantic bleaching.
Right, where the words have been used so frequently in political discourse that they've lost their original, hard-hitting impact.
Exactly. So for a skeptical audience, or even a swing voter, deploying those words without immediate, rigorous justification just activates their internal spam filter.
Yet they assume they're just listening to standard political mudslinging rather than a serious critique.
Exactly.
And that semantic bleaching is exactly the hurdle. My suggestion to improve this is to deliberately map out the logical leap for the listener.
Okay, so spell it out a bit more.
Yeah, the author needs to explain the why and the how. Like, how does focusing on Jewish terror at that specific moment fulfill the definition of those heavy labels in this precise context?
I see.
The writer has to reverse that semantic bleaching by attaching the label to a specific, undeniable action. Instead of having the listener roll their eyes at the hyperbole, the goal is to make them realize that the label, as shocking as it is actually the most accurate description of the behavior.
Well, I can see what you're going for here. Let's see how we can strengthen this. Because if the goal is a fiery, rapid-fire political broadcast, does stopping to explain definitions risk slowing down that passionate, urgent pacing?
That's a valid worry, but mapping out the logic absolutely does not mean writing a dry academic essay.
Right.
The explanatory bridge can be constructed in a single, punchy sentence that maintains the fiery tone while actively providing the necessary logical scaffolding.
Do you have a concrete example of how that might look?
Sure. So instead of simply declaring him a fascist and an anti-Zionist, the author could insert an explanatory bridge like, to focus on Jewish terror at the exact moment 2 Jews are murdered is to invert the victim and the aggressor, a framing that strips Israelis of their right to self-defense, which is fundamentally anti-Zionist.
Oh, I like that. That framing shifts the burden entirely. It keeps the emotional heat high, but it grounds the attack in a recognizable philosophical argument.
Exact. The listener doesn't have to guess why the author chose the word anti-Zionist.
Right. The text explicitly defines it as the denial of the right to self-defense and then just demonstrates how Golan's quote executes that denial.
Yeah, it's clearly laid out. I wonder, though, if we've considered the cumulative effect of using multiple heavy labels at once.
Like stacking fascist and anti-Zionist right next to each other?
Exactly. When an author does this, it can inadvertently dilute the impact of both terms. It kind of signals to the listener that the writer is just throwing every available insult at the wall to see what sticks.
Yeah, scattershot approach.
Right. Choosing one highly specific label, like we did in that concrete example, and meticulously proving it almost always yields a much more persuasive result.
So by narrowing the focus to a single, provable charge, the attack actually becomes sharper.
Definitely.
But if the author successfully re-anchors that label to Golan, using that logical bridge, they still have to deal with the rest of the political coalition. The actual goal of this piece isn't merely to condemn Golan. It's to warn voters away from his political partners.
Right, the broader target. Let's look closely at the section discussing the electoral warning regarding Eisenkot and Bennett. Well, bridging the gap between a singular provocative quote and a sweeping electoral warning ensures the audience follows the logical escalation of the argument.
Yes.
But the structural weakness we see here is that the text abruptly shifts from analyzing the Havat Gilad incident directly into a broad warning to the ideological right about voting for Eisenkot and Bennett.
It just skips a step.
Exactly. It assumes the listener automatically accepts that Eisenkot and Bennett share or tolerate Golan's exact views.
Which leaves a massive gap in the persuasive logic.
Huge gap. There is a high risk that voters might view Golan's statement as an isolated gaffe rather than a systemic coalition threat.
It feels a bit like a prosecutor in a courtroom trying to secure a conviction for an entire criminal enterprise based on the actions of one low-level operative.
That's a perfect analogy.
Acknowledge he might be out of line, but they won't convict the politician sitting next to him on the debate stage unless the author proves they handed him the microphone.
We really have to consider the burden of proof here. The base voter might only require a preponderance of evidence, but a swing voter requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt before abandoning their traditional party.
Totally. And right now, that connection is definitively an area that needs bolstering. So my suggestion to resolve this structural gap is to establish a clear mechanism of complicity.
Okay, how do they do that?
The author must explicitly show how aligning with Golan makes these partners responsible for his worldview, thereby turning a vote for them into a vote for his rhetoric. It isn't enough to point out that their names appear on the same ballot.
Right. The writer needs to show the active toxic exchange of ideology between the figures, forcing the listener to see the coalition as a single ideological organism.
Exactly. And building on that point, what if we looked at it from the perspective of the unconvinced voter?
Okay.
The swing voter often relies on a specific psychological safety net. They want to believe that they can vote for a coalition and that the moderate figures, like Eisenkot or Bennett, will naturally restrain the more extreme figures, like Golan.
Ah, right. So the author's primary structural job in this middle section is to aggressively dismantle that comforting illusion.
Yes. And to give a concrete example of how to execute this, the author could insert a highly targeted transition that forces the issue.
Like what?
Something like, by remaining silent while their partner blames the victims, Eisenkot and Bennett are actively endorsing this world. Or they could write, a vote for the ideological right that partners with Golan is a vote to bring this exact rhetoric directly into the governing coalition.
Oh, those transitions are great. They remove the idea that a voter can order a la carte. It clarifies that they're buying the whole package and that the silence of the moderates is a feature, not a bug, of the coalition.
Exactly. It forces the audience to confront the reality of coalition politics. You aren't just voting for the person at the top of the ticket. You're voting for the ideological red lines they're willing to erase to form a government.
Yeah.
By establishing that clear mechanism of complicity, the text transforms a complaint about one man into a robust structural argument against the entire alliance.
But once you've built this chain of evidence connecting the extreme statement to the broader coalition, you still have to defend it from opposing counsel. The final step in this critique is ensuring the argument is bulletproof against the most obvious counterattacks from political opponents.
Right.
As I understand it from the notes, the argument here is that the specific timing of Golan's quote is what makes it unforgivable.
Yes, preempting potential defenses of an opponent's statement fortifies the argument against immediate dismissal by skeptical listeners.
And the glaring weakness in this final section?
It's that the text completely ignores whatever context prompted Golan to mention Jewish terror in the first place. The piece treats the quote as if it occurred in a total vacuum.
Ah, I see.
By omitting his context entirely, the piece leaves itself incredibly vulnerable. Critics will instantly claim the author is intentionally taking him out of context, which undermines the credibility of the entire critique.
This touches on the mechanics of trust between a political commentator and a skeptical listener. I mean, the quickest way to lose a swing voter is to let them discover you hid relevant information from them.
Totally.
Once a skeptical listener believes you're manipulating the context, they will immediately tune out everything else you've built. It gives the opponent the easiest out imaginable.
All they have to say is, you're twisting his words, and suddenly the entire debate is focused on the author's journalistic integrity rather than Golan's actual controversial statement.
So how do we fix that?
My suggestion here is to use a brief steel manning technique. You acknowledge the opponent's context briefly, and then immediately dismantle it to demonstrate why it still doesn't excuse the dangerous rhetoric.
That's a great approach.
Yeah, by bringing up the context yourself, you rob the opponent of their primary defense mechanism, and you demonstrate a supreme confidence in your own argument.
Writers in passionate political spaces are often terrified of giving their opponents any oxygen at all, though there's this pervasive fear that by mentioning the opponent's context, they're somehow validating it.
Right. But the reality of frame control is that by dragging the opponent's best excuse into the light yourself, you actually get to dictate how the audience perceives it.
Do we have a concrete example for this?
Yes, the author could add a sentence like, even if Golan was referencing fringe vigilante acts that occurred that day, elevating that issue over the cold-blooded murder of 2 Jews shows a dangerous misalignment of priority.
That perfectly executes the inoculation. It acknowledges the excuse, the fringe vigilante acts, and then just crushes it under the weight of the actual tragedy by pointing out the severe misalignment of priorities.
That makes sense, but could the evidence also support a different conclusion, like a defender arguing that Golan is simply capable of multitasking?
What do you mean?
Like a savvy political opponent might say, he is a complex thinker capable of mourning the murders while simultaneously warning against a different kind of violence.
Oh, sure.
That is the counter-argument the author must anticipate. But because our concrete example explicitly utilizes words like elevating and misalignment of priorities, it specifically addresses the prioritization of his grief and his warnings.
Right. It neutralizes that multitasking defense before it can even be fully articulated.
Exactly. It proves that prioritizing the warning over the mourning is the core moral offense.
The strategic risk here is an interesting one, though. Could someone argue that by introducing the context of vigilante acts, we are inadvertently reminding the listener that there might actually be a problem with Jewish terror, thereby doing Golan's work for him? Yeah, that makes sense.
The murder of 2 citizens carries a profoundly different emotional and moral weight than the abstract threat of fringe vigilante act. By placing them side by side, in the open, and explicitly calling out the misalignment, you are directing the audience's gaze to the sheer disproportion of Golan's focus.
You aren't doing his work for him, you're exposing the moral bankruptcy of his timing.
Exactly. If you ignore the context, his defenders control the frame by crying foul. If you introduce the context and destroy it, you own the frame entirely.
Right, and that elevates the text from a simple emotional rant into a structurally sound, highly persuasive political architecture. Let's take a moment to quickly recap the main thrust of our critique today. We analyzed how to transform a passionate emotional appeal into a logically robust, persuasive argument.
Right, and to achieve that structural strength, we offer 3 actionable suggestions in rapid succession.
Let's hear them.
First, unpack heavy labels like anti-Zionist with specific reasoning tied directly to the Havat Galat event.
Got it.
Second, add a linking sentence explicitly making Bennett and Eisenkot complicit in Golan's words. And third, briefly acknowledge and then dismantle the context Golan's defenders might use.
Fantastic. Well, thank you to the listener for submitting this compelling material. We know how much effort goes into writing these pieces, and constructive feedback is the absolute best tool for growth. We warmly invite you to submit your revised work back in for another critique down the line.